So good afternoon, everyone. My name's Phil Swan. I'm one of the business development managers at Cardiff University within the Continuing Professional Development Unit. So welcome to the very last session of what has been a very busy 2 weeks of our spring online school organised by the CPD unit. This particular session is actually very timely as we've just launched a new course called Thinking About Teaching, Reflections on Education, which will be run over June and July this year and consists of evening live sessions and flexible self-study content. So it's great to have so many of you joining us this afternoon. Just while we wait for the last few people to arrive, I'm just going to run through some housekeeping with you. So if you have any technical issues, please feel free to use the chat feature in this Zoom webinar. Myself and my colleague Jessica Gasson should be able to help you out with any sort of sound issues, anything like that. If your Wi-Fi drops out, conscious that most of us are probably working from home at the moment, if your Wi-Fi drops out, please feel free just to reuse the link that we sent you and we'll readmit you back into the session. We'll be here to do that from the sidelines, so you won't interrupt the flow of the session or anything like that. We're looking to do questions and answers on a fairly flexible basis on this webinar, so feel free to post your questions as we go through, but also we might do some questions and answers at the end if there are any outstanding that we've not covered off. Finally, we are going to be recording this session content onto our YouTube channel. We'll send you a link out to that at the end, but there's the back catalogue of the other sessions that we've run as part of the Spring Online School. So I think that's enough from me. I think everyone's now arrived for the session, so I'll hand you over to our fantastic speakers, Emmajane Milton, Dr. Alex Morgan, and Heather Pennington. Thanks very much.
Hello everyone.
Hi folks. It's quite strange here because I know you're out there, but I can't see you from where I'm sitting. So very warm welcome. I'll have to believe you're there.
Okay, so as Alex has said, we can't see you. So what we'd like you to do is engage with us through the chat bar function. So if you are new to Zoom, I'll just highlight where that is. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a little runner. And one of the icons there is like a speech bubble and it says chat. So I'm going to pop a message in the chat that asks you to tell us who you are and why you're interested in teaching. And what we'd like you to do is respond to us. So communicate with us through the chat bar and tell us who you are and why you're interested in teaching. So we'll give you a couple of minutes just to put some information in, just so we can start to build up a little community here for the next 50 minutes or an hour.
And while you're doing that, Heather, Alex and I are going to tell you a little bit about why we got involved in teaching and our stories and how we entered into the teaching profession. I think Heather's going to kick off.
Okay, so how did I enter? I grew up in a family of teachers, a family of educators, variety of sectors, primary, secondary, SEN. My father ran a sailing school, trying to encourage people who weren't from a particular privileged background that this is something they could do. So I kind of grew up in that environment and was aware of the demands, rewards and challenges of teaching. And was doing a lot of work in my late teens with a charity, Action for Children, and they work with supporting, protecting vulnerable children. And that was something that really interested me. And I decided to become a probation officer. On the back of that, I was working with young offenders and was really interested in the social justice element. So I went away to university, worked with the probation service, and that took me then to work with the police, but I was really interested in the social justice element. I went and worked in America as part of that. And if you have seen the series The Wire, when they did the series on education, that was me. That was where I was. So my second day was how to deal with a gunshot wound. So it was working with protecting vulnerable children in a way I hadn't worked with in the UK. And it really kind of it cemented how important I thought education was for empowering and changing lives. Came back to the UK and did my PGCE working with the post-compulsory sector. So people after 16, and I worked in a college, in an FE, further education college, for 15 years, working with people who were what we call entry level, so adults who maybe were illiterate, all the way through to people who had they wanted to be teachers, so they were after their degrees, they wanted to carry on their studies, and I worked with them as postgraduates. Carried on working in the post-compulsory sector, worked my way up through the leadership team, and was increasingly supporting educators with their practice and working with inclusive practice. So as I say, I didn't set out with a clear roadmap. My journey's a little bit diverse, but it brought me into education because I strongly believe in the transformative and empowering elements that education has. So that's kind of my backstory and where I've come from.
Hi, my name's Alex. I left school not intending to be a teacher at all. I was going to do my science degree, and I did my science degree, and I did my science PhD. And it turned out that whilst I was doing my PhD, which was a kind of joint biosciences, artificial intelligence PhD, the bit that I enjoyed much more than doing the PhD was the bits of demonstrating and supporting students in tutorials that I'd done. And so at that point, I also got some experience, mostly for money at that time, of teaching in a secondary school. And I'd found that I really enjoyed doing that too, teaching some secondary science. It was in a private school at that time. I didn't have a PGC. And I'd enjoyed that so much, I thought, you know what, I'll go and get a PGC. And I found it takes quite a long time to get on a PGC program. Couldn't get on a PGC program very quickly. And the most straightforward way of me doing that, not least because by now I had a 4-year-old, was to go and do a graduate teacher training program in the school my child was at. And so I went there and I thought I was going to be pretty good at this because I taught at university. And I'd taught my chemistry and biology and a little bit of maths in a secondary school. And so I was going to be well equipped to go and teach in a primary school classroom. It was in the nursery classroom with kind of 3-4-year-olds that I think I learned how to teach, that I learned what teaching was really about. When I was stripped of my content knowledge, because actually really the things that I needed to be sharing with the children needed me to understand very deeply the misconceptions around what they needed to know. They didn't really care what I knew about covalent bonding and chemistry, or whether I could make paracetamol. They cared about the relationships I had with them and how well I could interact with them and the extent to which I could meet them where they were, and how to manage that for a whole group of learners successfully. And so for me, it was in primary and with young learners that I feel that I learned most about pedagogy and supporting learning. And then gradually, I brought that back into working in initial teacher education and now working with master's students on a national programme. And I think even some of those skills I learned in the nursery classroom I was using yesterday when I did an exam for I was external examiner for a PhD thesis. I think that was just all using the same skills about relationships and bringing out the best in your learner and being supportive and making a nurturing experience. I hope I did, because they wrote to me today and said that's how it worked out. So I hope I learned something from my journey.
Thanks both. I'm Emmajane, and it's so lovely to learn a little bit about you guys. Thanks Charlotte and Teresa and Jermaine for contributing on the chat. If anybody else wants to, that would be great. A little bit like Alex, I had no intention of coming into education, and I started my career working in theatre and television, and did that for quite a long time, did all sorts of very exciting things in those roles, and met exciting people and travelled and did lovely things. And then I found myself in the north of England in a primary school, and there was something a 4-year-old said to me when we'd taken in a theatre and education production that made me go, I need to understand that. I need to understand why that little boy just said what he did and what was making him think. So I gave it all up, a good career, an exciting career, and retrained to be a teacher. And that was when I was in my late 20s. And I haven't looked back. It's the best job in the world. So yeah, I'm really excited to be here, really interested in working with you. I've been teaching in primary. I've taught all primary age groups. I've done a little bit in secondary. So lots and lots, I think, to draw on. And most recently, obviously, I've been working in higher education as well. So really pleased to be here and to learn about you. And what we're going to start talking about now, and again, we're really hoping you can contribute with us on the chat function, is the kind of purposes for teaching and for education, and what it's all about. And in very simple terms, I guess, there are often considered to be 5 different key things to think about. You know, is the purpose of education to prepare young people for the job market? Maybe, maybe not. I'm not sure that's what I necessarily believe. Is the purpose of education to allow young people to fulfill their potential? Lots of us who've been homeschooling our children over the last 15 months will think a lot about that, how we've helped them to fulfill their potential, how we've helped them think about their learning. Is the purpose of education to create good future citizens? Is it for young people to learn important pieces of knowledge? And I can see an error there on my screen. Sorry about that, folks. So for young people to learn important pieces of knowledge. And then the final thing is the purpose of education for young people to learn about how to think independently and critically through experimenting and experience. And what we'd really like to know is what your thoughts are on this. Which one of those 5 things resonates the most? And we've put the kind of formal names in brackets at the end, but what resonates with you? What do you feel the purpose of education is for? And I guess the other thing I often think about when thinking about this is it different for different people? Would the government say that the purpose of education is different to what you might say, or a head teacher might say, or an educationalist or a university, or your learners? What would they say?
Yeah, and do you feel it alters at different ages and stages? Do you feel it remains the same as you go through from being a 3-year-old learner right through to finishing a PhD?
If you're happy to speak out loud, please do, and you can. Otherwise, pop your ideas into the chat. Pop your ideas into the chat about what you feel is the purpose of education? You align with progressivism mostly? Yeah, the idea that we want young people to learn to think independently and critically and experiment and experience things. Amanda, you're talking about sharing knowledge and skills, really important. Any other thoughts? Any other ideas? Yeah, romanticism is absolutely, you know, to allow people to fulfill their potential. Of course, that's what we want. I guess. And some of us are on that continuum in different places, and we might move to different parts on that continuum at different times within our experiences. I think we'll have thought differently about it as we've been through the pandemic to maybe how we thought about it before that. Charlotte, you're saying all that you've mentioned in the slide, and it might change, exactly right. It might change as a child progresses through various stages of their life or their education or their career. The purpose might become different. Okay, we're going to carry on thinking a little bit about what the purpose is and what it's all about. And what we want you to think about now, and we're going to flip on to the next slide where what we really want to think about, what are the things that you might consider are really important in terms of good teaching for all age groups. So whilst the purpose might change, what do we think is really important for good teaching, regardless of age or stage? So whether you're teaching a 3-year-old, a 12-year-old, a 19-year-old, a 50-year-old, or an 82-year-old, what's really important about good teaching? And that might support good learning. Absolutely right, a learning environment where everyone feels safe and supported. Absolutely fundamental. Interaction, yeah, learning interactions, the relationships, the way you work together in terms of education.
Yeah, and Grace, that safe and supported is an interesting one, isn't it? Because it can't just be safe and supported without any pressure at all to do anything, or there's a kind of stagnation. There's an art to making sure that you're gently moving, swaying, nudging, taking your learners in a particular direction in a way they feel safe and supported, but there's movement, there's learning happening. And so I think there's a real art that too much pressure, they'll go into survival mode. Not enough pressure and they'll just stagnate. So safe and supported, but with movement for me, there's something going on there.
Yeah, and that kind of links in with Charlotte's point about the importance of personal skills, you know, building up those relationships, being able to be approachable and have a connection with the people who you're working with so that they feel safe, they feel secure, and then they're ready to engage. So that kind of links in there with Charlotte's point.
So what we've got on the screen at the minute is this interesting idea around relationships, absolutely fundamental, and that speaks to the feeling safe and secure, being approachable, all of those sides of things. And then this idea of learning and content and skills and stuff to learn and how that might come about. So there's some really interesting things to think about there, and what the relationship is between the two.
Yeah, and I guess what we'd like you to do now, we talked a little bit there about, you know, what we think makes a good teacher. We want you to think back in your history and think a little bit about the best teacher you ever had, okay? And just then pop into the chat about something about what their role was. So whether you're primary teacher, or was it something that happened when you were in FE college or whatever, and what made them great to you? What was it about them that made them a good teacher? Okay, I think that's worth sharing. I mean, I can think back to a great teacher that I had when I was in university. And the reasons that I think they were a great teacher, I think they were a great teacher because they absolutely loved their subject. They were highly knowledgeable about their subject, but they took a joy in knowing their students and sharing that love they had of their subjects with their students. And they were very clever at representing the knowledge they had, the biological knowledge they had, visually. And they were a good artist, and they could draw things visually in a way that really captured our understanding. But they knew us, they talked to us, they cared who Alex was, and they were able to share this in a really clever way.
Alex, it was brilliant. As you were saying that, Amanda popped in the chat, interested in or interesting subject, but also really interested in their students. And that's absolutely right. And thanks, Claire. Mr. Gregory. And the lovely thing about this is where we can all remember their names as well, isn't it? You know, those teachers that made a phenomenal difference to us. Funny, passionate, knowledgeable, and could command a room of unruly teenagers. Okay. Sorry, go on, Heather.
I just think that kind of links into Grace's point here about how they wanted to listen. You know, that great teacher could command this room of unruly teachers because they were interested and they wanted to listen. You know, they thought they were exciting and they had this connection. You know, you talking here in the chat bar. And so some of the things you say are lovely. They're kind of merging and linking, and these lovely accounts you're having, these reflections of these great teachers. We can see there are similar themes that are emerging in your accounts.
And it makes me think of the idea that when we meet new people, we generally make two judgments about them. I'm listening to you, but do you actually know anything? Do you have any kind of expertise or understanding what you're talking about? And also you're making the judgment, are you going to do me over? Am I going to be safe with you? Okay. And I think we're certainly making those judgments right from being quite young children about our teachers. Is what they're saying to me sensible, and am I learning something? But also, am I okay? And perhaps to different extents, by the time we get to higher education, we're perhaps more keen that we can look after ourselves and we're worried about content knowledge. But unless teachers really care about us and are inclusive, and we also make judgments about how our teachers treat other people in a class or a group we're teaching. It isn't just because what happens to them now might happen to us later. Okay. So I think we weigh up all those things. It's no good just being the chosen one you're only nice to. You're only being the one being cared for. It's important it happens to everyone.
So much of what everybody's saying is around how teachers make you feel. Do they make you feel that you can do it, you can achieve it, you can get there, or do they make you feel inadequate, not confident, lost? And those are things we've got to think really carefully about as educators. How are we making all of our students feel by the way that we're acting and what we're doing? Sorry, Heather, I interrupted again.
No, I was just going to say, yeah, the things that you're talking about there, Emmajane, linked to Charlotte's point here, and the one word that stands out for me in her last comment is that word overlooked. You know, her feeling of being overlooked as a student, and how powerful that feeling can be, and the impact that can have on your experience as a learner. You know, and as we can recall these fantastic teachers and these fantastic recollections that we have, I'm sure somewhere we can also recall the less pleasant experiences as well. And so these relationships and the connections we have, I think that's really what's coming out. But as I say, Charlotte, that phrase overlooked, I thought was so powerful in your last comment there.
And Teresa, I'm sure a lot of this really resonates with you in your role training to be a physiotherapist. You know, so much is about building the confidence with your patients to have a go, to practice, to take on the activities or exercises you're recommending, to allow themselves to be manipulated in the way that they need to be manipulated. So much is about learning and confidence and relationships. Absolutely essential. What we're going to do next, building on this, is we're going to show you a video of a wonderful man called Sir Ken Robinson, who sadly died recently. And why we like to use this video, it's quite a short video, is it kind of helps us reflect on those things that are really important. So as you're watching, have a think about what he says and the things that resonate with you, and then we can have a little chat about that once we've seen it. Okay, so here goes, everybody. Hope this works okay.
It's a very interesting book published a number of years ago by a guy called Peter Brook, called The Empty Space. It's about theatre. And Peter Brook's career has been peppered with extraordinary productions which have changed the face of contemporary theatre in all kinds of ways. And he said in this book, it's about 25 years or maybe, that he is committed to making theatre the most powerful experience it can be. And so he says to do that, we have to be clear what it is. And to answer his own question, he performs a sort of thought experiment where he says, what's the irreducible minimum in a theatre experience? What can you take away and still have it? So he says, you can take away the curtains, the costumes, you can take away the script. A lot of theatre is not scripted. The director, you don't need directors. For theatre, you don't need the stage. Actually, you don't need the building. All you really need is an actor. It can be outdoors, in a clearing or in a car park. You just need an actor in a space and somebody watching. And it's the somebody watching that makes it theatre. The actor performs a drama. Theatre describes the relationship between the audience and the performance. So theatre is a relationship word. And he said it's that relationship that we should focus on, and we shouldn't add anything to it if it diminishes it or gets in the way of it. So his focus is always on the skills of the actors and deepening their understanding of the process and the response they're trying to engage with the audience. Well, the analogy for me with education is very powerful, because the role at the heart of education, there are students. I mean, if there were no students, then there'd be very little point having the system, would it really? If the place was just full of administrators, then they'd all be sitting around playing on their Candy Crush things. But the fact that there are students in the system is what this is all about. And we have to remember that the role of education is to help students to learn. And the people who do that are not the policymakers or the superintendents, it's the teachers who do that. So the heart of education is the relationship between teachers and learners. That's what it's about. And everything else should be focused on making that the best relationship possible. And the problem is that over time, all kinds of things have got in the way of it. Testing regimes, league tables, unions' bargaining rights, building codes, professional identities, the concerns of various pressure groups, the ideology of various political parties. And it's very easy for people to spend all day discussing education without mentioning the students at all. We end up talking about data and league tables and testing and budgets. But all of this is a complete waste of everybody's time if we forget that our role is to help students learn. And therefore the question is, so what should they learn, and how do we best do that? But all the great education systems, all the great schools know that. It's why they invest so heavily in the selection of teachers, why they insist on getting people who don't just have good degrees, even if they have them at all. They want people who know their material, but they also know that teaching depends upon a whole set of pedagogical skills and a love of the process. And it's more than the transmission of direct content. It's about having a set of skills that are focused on facilitating learning.
I love that video, because it reminds me of how when I started off teaching, I really did think it was all about the transmission of content, and I'd nailed it because I had this content knowledge and I was going to pass on my wisdom to the students or the secondary school children that I had, and how quickly I learnt that there was so much more to it than that.
So what I'm going to pop in the chat bar, I'm going to ask you again if you can respond to us and say, for you, what strikes you from the video? So what is it that Ken Robinson talked about that is most striking or was most pertinent for you?
I always think when I listen to Ken Robinson talk about how easy it is, and how I reflect on how many meetings I've sat in or experiences I've had where we're talking about education but we're not talking about learners, and it becomes easy in the busyness around education to forget who the most important person is, and the most important person are the learners. So we've got some great comments coming up here. The similarity with performance, never thought of it that way. Absolutely. It's a really interesting analogy there. And enthusiasm and motivation, thanks so much, Rianne. It's really interesting, isn't it? The things that are important. And so much of this comes back to feelings and emotions, and how you develop experiences of learning. And what influences that?
And the idea of performance is both useful, I think, and can be difficult, in that it's useful to think of it as performance and orchestration, almost performance and stage management, because the orchestration of what's going on in terms of when I do this, and this is meant to be captivating or motivating or engaging, whatever I do, how is that being experienced by the learner? Where are they then? A performance of two parts, a dance of two parts. I think it's useful to think of it that way.
And Grace,
links to Grace about the interpersonal relationships between two people, and going back to the analogy of it being a performance, you know, if it's a live performance, you feed off the audience and they feed off the actors, and so it's this, you know, there is this toing and froing. You get the feedback that kind of enhances what you do, and that at the core of that is the relationship. You know,
and that relationship, yes, to a certain extent, like we're with you now, this can exist in a one-off situation, but that's actually something you nurture and grow with the learners you work with over time, that you establish a culture so that learners understand the expectations of how they work together and how they work with you. And that it can be very difficult as a teacher if you intend to work that way, but you exist in a department, a school, a situation where the same thinking in terms of the way you interact with a learner, the culture you want to create in terms of nurturing, supporting relationships isn't held throughout a school or a department. So it's one thing to teach in a particular way, it's another thing to establish it as a way of working. It might be interesting to think about your recent learning experiences, and to think about the kind of quality of relationships or the level of interaction that you've had in those, in terms of thinking of that balance of content, skills and relationships, and your recent learning experiences. What kind of balance has there been?
I think a lot of what we're talking about here, Alex, and knowing your learners, you know, helps us then create that inclusive. The more we know about our learners, the more we can understand them, the more we can understand their needs, and we can create this safe culture, this climate, this ethos that's actually really inclusive. So Charlotte's put in here, you know, feeling valued and included. We really need to know our learners and create an environment that suits them, that works for them, where they feel included and valued. And we can do that through creating an inclusive learning environment. And sometimes that's about, you know, creating what we call inclusive pedagogy. So how you're working, how you are transmitting the knowledge, how you are creating working relationships that work for your learners, that are best suited to their needs.
Yes, and of course it depends what you're learning about, I guess, because there's several things that are important, aren't there, in a learning experience. How genuine, authentic it is in terms of how interested you are in it. Then the kind of opportunities you have for social interaction about that content you're learning about, in terms of Can I talk to other people about what I'm learning about? Can I get a chance to talk to the person who's teaching me about this, so that I can really get those pegs to hang my knowledge on? I know this is an authentic experience, it's genuinely interesting, it's about something, I can talk to people about it. And it's helpful if only then you get to the kind of higher order theoretical ideas to think about it. But very often when we teach children in school, we start off all the other way round. And we give them, first of all, these complex theoretical ideas. We don't make it very authentic. And then especially in the current context, where we've got COVID and things like that, we don't let them talk to each other about it very much. And so we do things kind of all the other way around. However, if you're learning in somewhere like about radiotherapy, or you're learning in a healthcare profession, you're probably learning to become a teacher. You're probably learning in a very authentic context. And for you, what will there be less of is opportunities to talk about it socially, which are important. You might get those reflective opportunities on a PGC, on a teacher training program. Very important to have the opportunity to reflect on that. And then the theorizing, the engaging with ideas perhaps from research or wider reading, that's something that happens, but I think that happens best socially as well. Learning about being a teacher, I think that happens best when you can talk to other people about it.
Grace, it's really interesting what you said about this analogy with performing, and whether you're a stage manager or an actor performer. And I think it is interesting, because some people do like to take on the role of performer and can be slightly eccentric, or as you've outlined, or very it's all about me, in the way that sometimes actors can be. I've worked as a stage manager, and sometimes actors are very much, it is all about me. Whereas I think it's really interesting to think about this idea of orchestrating something, and thinking about your learners, and thinking about the duty and the responsibility you have as an educator to enable your learners to learn. And so my job as a learner is to work out how to make what it is that we're working on together accessible, engaging, illuminating, something they feel that they can gain mastery over. And so my role is a facilitator in that way, or a stage manager or an orchestrator. So I often think about it in those kind of contexts. And I think it's really interesting when you start thinking about the learner's needs above everything, and how you facilitate that, whoever your learners are. And that means you have to really think about inclusive ways of working, and thinking about what individuals need as well as your collective group. And that's not about designing a curriculum or a learning experience that's targeted to each separate individual, but it's making sure the ways in which you work are accessible and engaging in different ways, so that whichever way your learners prefer to engage with content, they have choice and autonomy over that. So it's a really interesting way of thinking about that.
Yeah, I think there's something about putting yourself, I have to actively, I'm not very good at it, I don't think, so I have to actively put myself in the student's shoes, or put myself in the shoes of the class, somebody in the class that I'm teaching, to think, okay, this is what I've planned to do. Now, how does that feel if I'm a student on this program? I have to actively do it. And I think that can tell you a lot about why I might be motivated or not motivated to engage with different parts of content that I planned for a teacher, being a student. If it even makes sense. Sometimes when you just stand back and think about what you've planned to do from that different perspective, it's very interesting. And of course, the whole helps. The more you have opportunity to talk to your learners informally, to take time to understand exactly where they're coming from, the better you can provide for them in that way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what you're talking about there is reflection. And it's such a crucial part of being an educator, being a good teacher, is being able to see things from a different perspective, to be able to stand back and think, well, it's not about me being on, as Meghan Markle said, and then you're on. It's not about you. It's not about your show, your performance. And it's that ability to stand back and think, okay, how is this being seen, received, perceived? by so many other people, and what people, places, sources, data can I draw upon to help me kind of stand back and see it in the round through all of these different facets and how people are engaging.
And that, it's such a challenging thing to do. I mean, I used to joke that, you know, I used to program artificial intelligence programs, and then I went to do something much more complicated, which was to be a primary school teacher. But in another way, I wasn't joking, because it was so much more, the variables you're dealing with, the moral responsibility to get it right for those learners. You know, if my program didn't work, well, my program didn't work, and some people in the lab are a bit disappointed, and maybe we didn't get the paper done. But that's where it ended. I mean, this responsibility I had once I went to primary school, I knew I was impacting children's lives and the way they felt about themselves and their trajectories as learners, and the responsibility of that, and thinking about all the things you had to get right to get the climate in that classroom right, to support the needs of individual learners, to move your learners on with a gentle pressure where they felt safe and happy to learn what they wanted to do was huge.
Alex, you're so right. And you know, I think in many ways what you've said, there's an enormous duty and responsibility that comes with being a teacher or an educator, but it's the best job in the world. And you know, I stand by that. I've been a teacher, I've been a head teacher, I now work in this context. And I think one of the things that's so interesting with young children, and that's where many people will have had experiences over the last 18 months with their own children, is being able to explain tricky concepts to little people means you have to understand it incredibly well yourself, and you have to think about, how am I going to convey this in a way that makes sense? And I can't use big words or convoluted concepts. I've got to really take it back, strip it back. What's this really about? And how can I do this in a way that's engaging, that's interactive, and really consolidates and supports learning and understanding? But one of the things that also strikes me, listening to everybody and reading the chat, I mean, the chat's really fascinating, is this idea that it's a two-way process. And if you couple this two-way process with reflection, there's a real, a central part of that is the reciprocity you get from teaching. So I'm learning as the educator, learning from you as the learners, because we're talking about this all of the time, and my ways of thinking are being changed. The ways I have to think about educating are being changed because everybody's unique. So there's a real learning benefit for everybody involved in terms of learning interactions. It's a really exciting job.
Yeah, and that reflection and learning how to do that reflection well is so important, because well, it's a Plato kind of thing, but it's, you can't learn to know what you already know it. You can't learn to know what you don't know, because you don't know what you don't know. Okay, so what the opportunities for critical reflection do with others, with literature, reflection on your practice, that standing back lets you get past that kind of problem of thinking differently about your practice, and therefore improving in that way. And you know, Emmajane said it's the best job in the world. It is the best job in the world, because you're not going to get it right in any way, shape or form ever. If I went into a primary school classroom now, however much I've worked in IT, however much I'm sitting in Cardiff University talking about it, I am going to hit a whole number of problems, especially because I've done it for a while, but a whole number of problems, because every class is unique. Every context is different. But would I have an absolute joy in trying to get it right? Would I look forward to going into that classroom every morning and seeing my learners? Would there be genuine relationships between me and every one of those learners? You know, I can think of primary pupils I taught, you know, oh gosh, yeah, it really is going back that long ago, that I see now as adults with their own children. And I know that relationship, they remember me, and we talk about things we did. That stays with people, just like the best teachers you've talked about today. And that's a very special thing to have. That's not a quantifiable thing that you can measure about a job.
And I sometimes think we forget as we get older and progress in our adulthood, it's really difficult to unknow what we know, and teaching really makes you have to think about that. What is it like not to know some of this stuff? And so when you're teaching, and so many of us have had these experiences again through the lockdowns with our own children, when you're kind of going, so how do I explain long division? You know, how do I explain some of these concepts in a way that's accessible and relatable? I think it's really
often lots of theoretical understanding. You know, knowing and doing. Dewey talks about knowing and doing. There's very much the same thing. Your action speaks to what you really know, and how you work with a child who doesn't have one-to-one correspondence, so they don't know that when they move one counter, that's a 1, and when they move 2 counters, it's a 2. If they don't know how to do that and they can't quite grasp it, what are the whole kind of number of different ways you can work with that child so that they can get that one-to-one correspondence and grasp that, and the feeling of success for both of you in that relationship when you get there? Huge.
We're going to go on now to have a listen to another great educationalist, Dylan William. And he talks about this role of being a teacher, and then we'll pick back up together at the end.
I think the only way we can improve teacher quality is to create a culture of continuous improvement. And that is given lip service in many districts, but nobody's really facing up to what it really means in practice. You see, I think that every teacher needs to get better. In many districts, they target help at the teachers who need support, who need help, who are having difficulties. Well, you know what? Every teacher has difficulties. Every teacher fails on a daily basis. If you're not failing on a daily basis, you're just not paying attention. Because we fail all the time. Many of you will walk out of this room absolutely convinced I said stuff I know I didn't say. As teachers, we fail all the time. We teach these brilliant lessons, we take in the notebooks, we look at what the kids have written, and we wonder what planet they were on when we were teaching this stuff. Our daily experience as teachers is a failure, which makes it the best job in the world, because you never get any good at it. At one time, Andre Previn was the highest paid film score composer in Hollywood. And one day he walked into his office and he quit. And people said, "Why'd you quit this amazing job?" He said, "I wasn't scared anymore." Every day he was going into his office knowing his job held no challenges for him. This is something you are never going to have to worry about. This job you're doing is so hard that one lifetime isn't enough to master it. So every single one of us needs to accept the commitment
I agree with you, Charlotte. It is a fantastic video, isn't it? I love Dylan Williams. I love reading his work, but particularly watching him speak. And in answer to your question, yes, all practitioners are encouraged to engage in reflection. That should be something that's part of your, just a part of your everyday working process. And as we say, it takes a lot of time to learn to do critical reflection and to do it well and to do it in a meaningful way. But yes, it should be part of your working practice.
Yeah, and I think as kind of the Dewey quote that was just shown there, that kind of critical reflection is just useful for everyone in all walks of life. And if we actually really look at our jobs, there are very few jobs, I think, where there isn't some element of teaching involved in it, because when we work with colleagues, we often do that. When we share our ideas, we often do that. So whether it's formal, a job that's formally thought of as being teaching and educational, I think critical reflection is always useful.
I think it's interesting, Charlotte, and I think, Heather and Alex are absolutely right. It's a critical part of educational practice at whatever level. Whether it's when you think about becoming a teacher and you go through your initial teacher education, whether it's your practice as a classroom teacher, whether it's as you develop through your practice into leadership roles, and at all levels, primary, secondary, further education, higher education. However, it's tricky and it doesn't necessarily come naturally. And of course, in the busyness of doing the job, it's often one of the things that can get neglected. And so there's a real imperative and a real importance for schools and school cultures to foster, create and support environments where this happens, both independently, but sometimes better than anything, collaboratively and dialogically with each other. So in the way that we're doing today, Alex, Heather and I don't teach in isolation, ever, if we can help it, because we like working with each other. And when we work with each other, we can be much more critically reflective. And today, when we finish today's session, we'll say, well, what did we think about that? What were the things that went well? What were the things that were tricky? How could we have changed it? How could we have done things better? What would we have changed if we had more participants, if we had less participants, if you were able and willing to speak out loud? What would we do differently? So there's always reflection built into the way we work. But that's tricky. And it's tricky to find the time to do that.
Yeah, I think in terms of teachers encouraged to reflect on practice in primary, I think teachers are encouraged to reflect a lot. Sometimes reflection is used to talk about so many things, it becomes almost meaningless, because what's really helpful is if the reflection is quite deep and quite critical about, so it really comes to new understandings. And that only happens when those kind of features we've talked about today are present. I guess, it's safe. There's enough pressure in that there's a problem you want to think about, but it's not too pressured in that you've got some space and time to think about it. It needs to be a situation where you feel safe to think about that, but also maybe have got some new understandings. That's the kind of thing we do on the sessions that we're taking forward, is sharing some of those understandings in different areas that might help you think critically about your practice. And absolutely, that kind of disturbance to what's going on, where practice changes, is almost always a catalyst for thinking differently about what you're doing. I would agree.
I think there's some interesting things in the chat coming up now. Yes, COVID undoubtedly has made practitioners at all levels think and reflect on their practice in a way that they haven't had to do necessarily in the recent past. Because what it's done is it's made us re-examine what we do and think about, well, how can we do this in a different way? How can we do this and build relationships when we're working remotely? How can we do this and encourage interactions and that community of learning in a different way? I mean, Grace, I think your point is really important as well. Overworked and overtired, yes, absolutely. And it can get lost. It doesn't always get lost. But there's something about how we create these cultures within schools and within organisations. And as Alex has said, there are very few jobs, I believe, that don't require you to do some kind of reflection, because you're educating, you're working, you're teaching in a way that's collaborative, and you can always reflect and do things better and differently. But I suppose it's about building those things into normal everyday practice. I think part of that is about teaching around reflection and encouraging children and young people and learners to be reflective about their own learning, about what they're learning, about that experience of learning. But it's also creating environments where you're not seeking to prove an answer. You're not seeking to say, well, I've reflected on that and that worked, so I'm going to do that again every time in this situation. It's saying, okay, I've reflected on that, and that was really helpful in this context. And what I learned was when I do this, this, and this might work, but also my learners next time are going to be different. So it's understanding that nothing's static, nothing is fixed. Everything is constantly moving. And so you have to reflect to keep up in many ways. I don't know whether that helps answer the question.
I think about advising about how time could be protected or built in for reflection. I think the bit you said about how we try in our day-to-day business of teaching to deprivatize our practice so that we're less self-referential about what we're doing. Because if your ego's as fragile as mine, it's very easy at the end of a session to kind of say, well, that was all right, wasn't it? That was all right. And very often when you're talking together, it's getting past it, that'll be all right, to do the more difficult and dirty work of talking about what we think wasn't quite as good and what we'd like to make better. That is the really useful part of that talking together.
And that horrible realization when learners brilliantly ask you questions that you go, oh my goodness, they had no idea what I was talking about. I was imagining they completely got it. And of course, if they didn't, that must be that there's something wrong with them. No. If they didn't, there's something wrong with the way I've communicated that. And so that's for me to consider as a learner, as an educator, but to learn to think about that and reflect on that and do it differently. It's a really interesting way of thinking about things.
Yes, I mean, nobody's saying that teaching isn't hard work. I agree. But yes, I think you're right that how wonderful it can be perhaps isn't spoken about enough, because sometimes I do really feel that I'm very privileged to have the job that I have, and I do work with wonderful students and wonderful teachers in terms of their professional learning. So yeah, there's a balance, I think, but that's not to take away that some teachers are carrying huge workloads and things can be difficult.
And we're delighted that later on this year in the summer, in June and July, we're doing a module or a short course, and we would love it if any of you would be interested in joining with us. And as part of that, we're going to be expanding on lots of the ideas and concepts we've talked about today, things to do with reflection, with learning interactions, with delivery, with creating the right culture, climate and ethos for learning. So lots of the ideas, inclusion, lots of the ideas we've talked about with you today. And I
think key ideas that would be useful in terms of wherever you want, whatever sector you wanted to go out and teach in afterwards, thinking about in terms of quality learning interactions, what difference they can make right from the earliest years, the kind of interactions that learners have at home and in school, and how then that plays out when they get to university. So I think there's a lot of content there, but also a lot there about ways of working and ways of reflecting that are very useful for people who would be going into teaching. I wish I'd had that.
Okay, are there any final question and answers? I'm just conscious of time. So I'm just wondering if you have any other comments, queries, questions that you want to raise as we come towards the final stages of our session here today. Please do pop them in the chat.
I don't think we've had any come through the Q&A tab yet. So if anyone does have any questions, it might be easier if you perhaps unmute yourself and ask them if anyone would like to do that.
Brilliant question, Charlotte. What's the most frustrating aspect of teaching? In a way that that every day is different, and you have to be on your toes, and you're learning all of the time. It's frustrating and wonderful all at the same time. So that's, and that you have to constantly problem solve. But that for me is equally the most exciting bit.
And
I would agree.
Yes, because you're not masters of the universe, you don't have control of everything that you might like to about your context to change. So you might be timetabled to teach at a certain time with a certain room with certain equipment, and you would like your learners to have access to different things. So it's wanting things for your learners in a certain context that you just can't have access to because of resources and things like that. Can be frustrating.
Yeah, but that's sort of the creative joy as well, and that's what you say when you put it all back. You can't rely on technology. You can't rely on all of the whizzy bangy stuff. You've got to really draw on your relationship and your pedagogy, and it is a challenge, but it's also the reward. So echoing Dylan Williams, it is the best job in the world.
Thank you so much for joining us today, everybody. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Yes, good to meet you briefly in chat, folks. Hope you come and join us.
So I think that takes us to the end of our session now. So a big thank you to our speakers, Emmajane, Alex and Heather, for their interesting insights into this session. And thank you for the attendees as well. Please do take time to look at the new Thinking About Teaching Reflections on Education course. We'll send you out a link for that. But if you do have any questions, we're quite a friendly team here. So please just drop us a message and we can arrange a chat about the course if you would like. Finally, we'll also send out some feedback questionnaires over the next few days. We'll be very grateful if you could fill these in. We do take time to read them carefully and they do help to inform future similar sessions. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.